Let's get started. Story number 1.
It was a crisp October evening, the kind where the air is tinged with the scent of dry leaves and distant bonfires. Emma sat cross-legged on her couch, her laptop perched on the coffee table in front of her. She was house-sitting for her aunt in a secluded suburb while her aunt vacationed in Europe. It was a favor she'd done many times before, but tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air she couldn't quite explain. The house was old, with creaky floors and shadows that stretched unnaturally under the dim light of antique fixtures. Emma had grown up visiting this place, but alone it felt foreign. The walls seemed too tall, the rooms too still. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the old grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9 p.m. She glanced at her phone. No new messages. Her best friend, Mia, had promised to check in, but hadn't yet. Shrugging off her unease, Emma decided to distract herself with a horror movie, a questionable choice given her already heightened nerves. As the movie's eerie soundtrack filled the living room, Emma heard a faint creak. She froze, her hand hovering over the bowl of popcorn. The sound came again, this time louder, as if someone were walking on the second floor. Her rational mind told her it was just the old house settling, but her pulse quickened. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No response, just silence. Then, another creak. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the staircase. The light danced on the wooden railing, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move. She swallowed hard. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered to herself, but her feet refused to move. Gathering courage, Emma climbed the stairs. The upper floor was a long hallway with 4 doors: her aunt's bedroom, the guest room she was using, a study, and the bathroom. Each door was slightly ajar, a detail she hadn't noticed earlier. She stepped cautiously, her sock-clad feet muffling her steps. The hallway felt colder than the rest of the house. As she approached her bedroom, the door creaked open just a little more. Emma's breath hitched. She pushed the door wide with trembling hands, her flashlight revealing nothing unusual. The bed was made, her suitcase still open on the chair, clothes spilling out. She checked the closet and under the bed, finding only shadows. Just as she turned to leave, she heard it. A whisper, soft, almost inaudible. Her name. Emma. Her heart slammed against her ribcage. She spun around, but the room was empty. "I'm imagining things," she whispered, backing into the hallway. Suddenly, all the doors slammed shut simultaneously with a deafening bang. Emma screamed, dropping her phone. The flashlight flickered wildly before going dark. Panic surged as she scrambled to pick it up, her hands trembling. She bolted downstairs, locking the living room door behind her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps as she clutched the phone, trying to calm down. She debated calling Mia or even the police, but what would she say? That the house was playing tricks on her? The room grew colder, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. Emma's eyes darted to the windows. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the world seemed unnaturally still. Then, she noticed something chilling, her reflection in the dark window. Behind her stood a figure. It was tall, shrouded in shadows with no discernible face, just a hollow darkness where a face should be. Emma spun around, but the room was empty. Her reflection, however, showed the figure still there, looming closer. She screamed again, stumbling backward. The reflection in the window changed, the figure now pressing a shadowy hand against the glass. The cold seeped into the room, and the lights flickered before going out entirely. In the darkness, Emma could hear whispers, multiple voices this time, unintelligible but insistent. She fumbled for her phone, activating the flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, but it didn't comfort her. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, darting just out of her line of sight. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. Emma clutched her head, her panic spiraling. "Leave me alone," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Then, silence. The lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. The warmth slowly returned, and the whispers faded. Emma's body shook as she stood there, unsure if it was over or if she was losing her mind. Her phone buzzed, startling her. It was a text from Mia. "On my way over. You okay?" Emma's fingers fumbled to type back. "Please hurry." Minutes felt like hours as she waited, every creak and groan of the house setting her nerves on edge. Finally, headlights washed over the driveway, and Emma ran to the door, throwing it open. Mia stepped out of her car, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping inside. Before Emma could respond, the door slammed shut behind Mia, and the lights went out again. Both women froze as the whispers returned, louder than before. Mia's face drained of color. "Emma, what is this?" "I don't know," Emma cried. "It started after I heard footsteps upstairs." The whispers crescendoed, and the shadowy figure appeared in the hallway, its presence sucking the air from the room. Mia screamed, grabbing Emma's arm. "We have to get out of here." They bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, its faceless void somehow staring directly at them. Emma's chest tightened as she felt an icy grip on her shoulder. And then, everything stopped. The lights flickered back on, the whispers vanished, and the shadow was gone. The door opened on its own, letting in a rush of cold night air. The two women didn't wait to question it. They sprinted to Mia's car and drove away without looking back. The next day, Emma returned with her parents and a priest. They blessed the house, finding nothing out of place, but Emma knew what she'd seen and felt. She never agreed to house sit there again. Months later, her aunt sold the property, claiming she'd grown tired of the upkeep. But Emma always wondered if her aunt knew the truth and if the shadows still lingered within those walls, waiting for someone else to come home alone. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The rain started around sunset, a steady drizzle that painted the windows in thin streaks and blurred the view of the world outside. Emma sat curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her lap and her laptop perched on the coffee table. She had the house to herself for the weekend. Her parents had gone to a cabin upstate for some much-needed rest. They had asked if she wanted to join, but Emma insisted she was old enough to stay home alone. She didn't mind being alone. In fact, she preferred it. The quiet gave her a sense of control, a rare luxury in her otherwise chaotic life. She had planned the evening perfectly. A scary movie, a bowl of popcorn, and a chance to catch up on her favorite true crime podcast. It was just her, the storm, and her cozy little world. But the first sign of unease came around 8:30 p.m., just as she was halfway through her movie. She had muted the TV during a commercial break and was scrolling through her phone when she heard it, a faint thud from upstairs. Emma froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. It could have been anything. The house was old, and it wasn't uncommon for the floorboards to creak or for random noises to echo through the pipes. She brushed it off, turned the volume back up, and tried to focus on the movie. Then it happened again. Another thud. This time, louder, as if something heavy had hit the floor directly above her. Emma's stomach tightened and she glanced at the ceiling. The living room was directly below her bedroom. Probably just the wind, she muttered to herself, though her voice lacked conviction. Max, the family's German shepherd, lifted his head from where he had been napping by the couch. His ears perked up and he let out a low growl, staring toward the staircase. Emma's heart began to race. "Max, stop! It's nothing," she said, but the dog didn't relax. He stood up, his tail stiff, and slowly made his way to the base of the stairs. He let out a sharp bark, his eyes fixed on the top landing. Emma hesitated. She didn't want to admit it, but the noise and Max's reaction had unsettled her. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it up the staircase. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the beige carpet and the framed photos lining the wall. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" Silence. Taking a deep breath, she decided to investigate. She couldn't sit there all night, wondering what was making the noise. Clutching her phone tightly, she ascended the stairs, Max close at her heels. Her heart pounded in her chest, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the top, she paused and shone the flashlight down the hallway. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed, just as she had left them. She walked toward her room, her bare feet silent against the carpet. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Her room was exactly as she had left it. Bed neatly made, laptop on the desk, and her sweater draped over the chair. But something felt off. The air was colder here, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin. She rubbed her arms and looked around. That's when she noticed it. The window, which she was sure she had closed earlier, was open, just a crack. Rain dripped from the frame onto the floor, forming a small puddle. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Had she forgotten to lock it? She didn't think so, but the doubt gnawed at her. She shut the window and locked it, her hands trembling. Just as she turned to leave, she heard it again. A thud, this time from the guest room down the hall. Her blood ran cold. Max barked again, his fur bristling. Emma crept toward the guest room, her footsteps cautious. The door was ajar, and she nudged it open with her foot. The room was dark, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. She swept the flashlight beam across the room, her pulse hammering in her ears. The closet door was slightly open. Emma froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The gap in the closet door was narrow, but she could just make out a sliver of darkness beyond it. It was the kind of darkness that felt alive, that seemed to watch her as she stood there. She wanted to run, to grab Max and lock herself in her parents' room until morning. But something compelled her to move closer, a mix of curiosity and dread. She reached for the closet door, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. Before she could pull it open, Max let out a ferocious growl and lunged forward, barking furiously at the closet. Emma stumbled backward, her heart leaping into her throat. The closet door creaked open slightly, as if nudged from the inside. And then she saw it, a hand. Pale, thin fingers curled around the edge of the door, gripping it tightly. Emma screamed and bolted out of the room, Max following her, his barking echoing through the house. She nearly tripped down the stairs in her panic, her mind racing. She grabbed the house phone from the kitchen and dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she could barely press the buttons. The operator's calm voice did little to soothe her as she stammered out what had happened. "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." Emma locked the front door and clutched Max's collar, her eyes darting toward the staircase. She could hear faint creaks above her, as if someone or something was moving around. The minutes stretched into eternity until red and blue lights flashed outside. The police searched the house thoroughly but found no sign of an intruder. The closet in the guest room was empty, and the wet footprints on the carpet had already begun to fade. The officers assured her that it was probably just her imagination, heightened by the storm and her being alone. But Emma knew what she had seen. She couldn't explain it, and she didn't want to stay in the house another second. She packed a bag and stayed with her best friend, Sarah, for the rest of the weekend. Her parents returned Sunday evening, and Emma told them everything. Her dad laughed it off, but her mom looked uneasy. Later that night, as Emma was unpacking, her mom knocked on the door and stepped inside. "You know," her mom said hesitantly, "the people who lived here before us, they left pretty quickly. Didn't say why, just up and moved." Emma stared at her, the weight of her mom's words sinking in. From that night on, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was never truly alone in the house. Even after they moved a year later, she would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, her heart racing, sure she could hear faint footsteps in the hall. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was a Friday night, and I was finally alone. My parents had gone away for the weekend, and my little sister Sophie was staying at a friend's house. I had the house to myself, and for the first time in a long while, I was looking forward to the peace and quiet. I was 23 years old, a recent college graduate, and the house had always felt like home to me. I was used to being here, alone or with family. That night, I settled in front of the TV with a movie and some popcorn. I was excited to relax. My parents had an old house built in the 1920s, and while it had its charm, it also had its quirks. The kind of quirks you might expect from a house with decades of history. The creaks in the floorboards, the occasional door that didn't quite close all the way, the draft that would sweep through on windy nights. I had never been spooked by these things. In fact, they were comforting. It was just part of living in an old house. Around 10:30 p.m., I turned off the TV and decided it was time to get some sleep. I made my way upstairs, passing through the dimly lit hallway. The house felt oddly silent, even more than usual, but I chalked it up to the fact that there were no other voices around, just my own footsteps and the sound of the wind outside. I reached my room and closed the door behind me. I switched off the light and climbed into bed, letting the darkness envelop me. I had just begun to drift off to sleep when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew clearer. It was coming from downstairs. It sounded like something heavy had been dropped onto the floor, then a second thud, followed by a scraping noise. I froze, my heart racing. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe something had just fallen, or it was the wind making the house settle. But the house had never sounded like that before. The scraping sound. It didn't feel natural. I pulled the covers off and slowly got out of bed. The house was still silent, but the unease in my stomach was growing. I reached for my phone and sent a quick text to Sophie, asking if she was still at her friend's house. I knew she wouldn't be back until the next day, but it felt reassuring to get a response. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer in my nightstand, and after a moment of hesitation, stepped out of my room. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the moonlight seeping in through the windows. The floor creaked under my feet as I made my way downstairs, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The first floor was eerily still. I checked the kitchen and the living room, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No overturned furniture, no signs of forced entry. Still, something didn't feel right. I walked toward the hallway that led to the back door. There was a small closet under the stairs, and the door to it was slightly ajar. I could see shadows moving inside. My pulse quickened. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, but the more I looked, the more I felt like something wasn't right. I stepped forward and gently pushed the closet door open. Empty. Nothing but coats and shoes. The door creaked closed behind me, and I let out a shaky breath, wondering if I was just imagining things. But then, from upstairs, I heard it again. A soft, deliberate step. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from an old house settling. It was too measured, too intentional. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was upstairs. I grabbed the phone from my pocket and dialed 911 without thinking. My heart hammered as I pressed the phone to my ear, waiting for the call to connect. The phone rang once, twice, then click. A voice on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? I think there's someone in my house, I whispered, barely able to get the words out. I'm alone. I heard something upstairs. I don't know what to do. Okay, stay calm, the dispatcher said. Where are you right now? I'm on the first floor, near the back door. I heard someone upstairs. They're not supposed to be here. Stay on the line and stay where you are. We're sending someone over right now. Keep the phone on you and don't go upstairs. I need you to stay on the phone until help arrives. I could hear the dispatcher's voice through the phone, but it felt distant. I kept my eyes trained on the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence felt suffocating. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow at the top of the stairs. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall and shadowy, its shape hard to define in the darkness. It seemed to be just standing there, watching me. I felt an icy chill run down my spine as I backed away, my legs shaking. Hello? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Who's there? The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stayed there at the top of the stairs. The dispatcher's voice came through the phone again. Stay where you are. They're on their way. But I couldn't stay still. The figure hadn't moved, and the silence in the house felt unbearable. I turned around, backing away from the stairs, my hand gripping the flashlight tightly. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there. That's when the light in the hallway flickered. For a split second, everything went dark. I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open, then a voice. Hello? It wasn't the voice of a stranger. It wasn't even a man's voice. It was a woman's voice. Soft, like a whisper. The air around me felt colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the empty hallway. My heart was in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The figure at the top of the stairs had vanished. But the voice remained. Come upstairs. I couldn't move. I couldn't respond. I just stood there, my mind racing, my body trembling. The voice called again, come upstairs. And then, as if to mock me, the front door slammed open. I heard it clearly, the loud bang of the door hitting the wall. It echoed through the house, shaking me to my core. I didn't wait to see who or what had opened the door. I ran. I ran out of the house, through the back door and across the yard. I didn't stop until I was at the neighbor's house, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood there, outside in the cold, staring back at my house. The lights flickered once more, but no one was inside. No one was home. The police arrived within minutes, but when they searched the house, they found nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence that anyone had been there. I never went back inside that house again. My parents never understood why. They thought I'd just been scared, but I knew what I saw, what I heard. The house was old, but it wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't just my imagination. Something was there, and it wasn't supposed to be. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a chilly November evening when Samantha found herself alone in the house. Her parents had gone out of town for the weekend to attend a family wedding, leaving her in charge of the house. She was 18, responsible enough, and honestly, she was looking forward to a quiet weekend. It had been a long week at school, and the idea of lounging in her pajamas, binge-watching her favorite series, and eating junk food sounded like heaven. The house was quiet, save for the occasional groan of the old wooden floors settling. It was a modest, 2-story home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Samantha had grown up here, so the sounds and quirks of the house were nothing new to her. At least that's what she told herself when the creaks began to feel different. It started around 9 p.m. Samantha was curled up on the couch in the living room, a blanket wrapped around her and a bowl of popcorn on her lap. The glow of the TV lit the room as a suspenseful thriller played. She was halfway through the movie when she heard it, a faint thud from upstairs. She paused the movie and listened, her ears straining against the silence. It was probably nothing. Maybe something fell over in her room or her parents' room. She shrugged it off and resumed her movie, trying to ignore the faint unease creeping up her spine. 10 minutes later, another sound, a soft creak like a footstep on the floorboards above her. This time, Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She muted the TV and sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The house was silent again, save for the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. "Get it together, Sam," she muttered, trying to laugh at her own nervousness. It was an old house. Old houses made noise. She turned the volume back up and tried to focus on the movie. The next sound was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate creak, followed by another and another as if someone or something was walking down the hallway upstairs. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed her mom. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried her dad. Same thing. They were probably at the reception, somewhere noisy where they couldn't hear their phones. For a moment, she considered calling the police. But what would she say? That she thought she heard footsteps in her house? That didn't exactly scream emergency. Instead, she decided to investigate. If it was nothing, she'd feel ridiculous for overreacting. But if it was something, well, she didn't want to think about that. She grabbed the baseball bat her dad kept by the front door, just in case, and started up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step felt heavier than the last, the old staircase creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the top, she paused, listening. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon through the window. All the doors were closed except for hers, which was slightly ajar. That was strange. She was sure she'd closed it earlier. "Samantha, you're being ridiculous," she whispered to herself. "There's no one here." But as she stepped closer to her room, she could feel it. An almost tangible sense of unease, like the air was heavier here. She pushed the door open, her bat raised and flicked on the light. Nothing. Her room was exactly as she'd left it. Clothes were scattered on the chair in the corner, her laptop sat on the desk, and her bed was unmade. She exhaled shakily, lowering the bat. Then she heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from her closet. Her eyes snapped to the closet door, which was slightly ajar. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared, willing herself to move but frozen in place. The rustling came again, faint but unmistakable. She gripped the bat tightly and edged toward the closet. Her hands were trembling as she reached out, grabbing the doorknob. She counted to 3 in her head, then yanked the door open, raising the bat to defend herself. Nothing. Just her clothes hanging neatly and a few boxes on the floor. She exhaled, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. She was letting her imagination get the best of her. Shaking her head, she closed the closet and turned back toward the door. That's when she saw it, a shadow moving across the hallway. She froze, her heart slamming against her ribs. It wasn't her shadow. She was standing perfectly still, and the light from her room didn't cast that direction. The shadow moved quickly, disappearing down the stairs. Adrenaline surged through her. She wasn't alone. Samantha bolted down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the wood. She ran to the front door, yanking it open, and stumbled onto the porch, gasping for air. She dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The operator answered, and Samantha quickly explained what had happened. They assured her that officers were on their way and told her to stay on the line. She stepped off the porch, moving toward the driveway to put distance between herself and the house. She glanced back at the house, the windows dark and still. For a moment, she wondered if she was overreacting. Maybe it really was her imagination playing tricks on her. Then she saw it. A face in the upstairs window, pale, expressionless, staring directly at her. Her blood turned to ice. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The face lingered for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. The sound of approaching sirens snapped her out of her paralysis. 2 police cars pulled up to the house, their lights flashing. She ran to meet the officers, explaining what she'd seen. They searched the house thoroughly, room by room, but found no one. No signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. Samantha spent the rest of the weekend at her best friend's house, unable to shake the image of that face in the window. When her parents returned, she told them everything. They dismissed it as her imagination, the result of being alone in a big, creaky house. But Samantha knew better. She knew what she'd seen. And she knew she'd never be comfortable in that house again. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Sarah was in her final year of university and had taken the opportunity to stay home while her parents visited her aunt in another city. She was familiar with the house, they'd lived in it for over a decade, and she liked the solitude. It was rare that she had the place to herself, and while she enjoyed the peace, she also found comfort in the routine. The creaks of the old wooden floors, like the sounds of the wind rattling the windows, it all felt like home. The house was tucked on the outskirts of a small town, away from the bustle of city life. Its large, leafy trees shaded the yard, and the surrounding woods seemed endless. There was an old, worn-down fence that circled the property, but Sarah had always felt safe in the space, despite the house's age. By the time her parents left that Friday evening, the house felt empty, and Sarah relished the quiet. She went about her usual routine, making dinner, catching up on her reading, and texting her friends. By 9, the house was dark, except for the soft light of her desk lamp. The weather had been dreary all day, and as Sarah sat on the couch scrolling through her phone, a gust of wind slammed into the side of the house. She looked up and noticed the shadows dancing across the walls, casting an eerie light. It was a familiar sensation, but for some reason, it felt more intense tonight. It started with the creaks. First, they came from the floor above, a light shuffling sound as if someone was moving around in the rooms above her. Sarah frowned, glancing at the ceiling. It wasn't uncommon for old houses to make noises, especially when the wind picked up, but it wasn't usually this pronounced. A shiver ran down her spine, and she tried to shake it off. It was just the house settling, she reasoned. Maybe a window had been left ajar upstairs, letting the wind push the house around a bit. The noise continued, though, a slow, deliberate movement. Not quite footsteps, but something akin to it. Sarah's pulse quickened. She stood up and walked toward the staircase, pausing at the base. The sounds were louder now, as if something or someone was pacing back and forth upstairs. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, half expecting her parents to have returned early. But when she looked at her phone, she saw no new messages or missed calls. The house remained still after her voice echoed through the empty hallway. Maybe she had imagined it. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to climb the stairs. Each step creaked beneath her, a constant reminder that she was alone in the house. As she reached the landing, she stopped and listened, hoping the noise would stop. But it didn't. It was coming from her parents' bedroom, a soft scraping sound followed by what almost sounded like a faint whisper. Goosebumps rose on Sarah's arms. She knew she had locked the door behind her when she left earlier. No one had been inside since, so how could anyone be in there now? Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could touch it, the door swung open on its own. A cold gust of air greeted her, making her flinch. Her parents' room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside, casting long shadows across the floor. There was nothing unusual in the room, nothing out of place, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She backed away from the doorway and turned to leave, but then she heard it again. A whisper, soft and muffled, as though someone was speaking right behind her. Frozen in place, Sarah turned slowly, her heart racing. The room felt colder now, almost as though the air was thick with something she couldn't see. It felt wrong. She reached for her phone, but it slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. As she bent to pick it up, she heard it. A thud, like something heavy falling to the floor in the next room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what it was, but the unmistakable sound of someone, something, moving was there. Something was in the house with her. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her parents' number, her hands shaking. No answer. She tried again, but still nothing. Sarah's anxiety skyrocketed as she thought of all the possible scenarios. Was someone in the house? Was she imagining things? She moved quietly down the hallway, trying to ignore the racing thoughts in her head. The house seemed darker now, even though she hadn't turned off any lights. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, growing louder with every step, almost as though someone was following her. The sound of something scraping against the wall brought her to a halt. Sarah looked back and saw the hallway light flicker, then go out completely. In the darkness, she heard what sounded like soft breathing, deep, raspy breaths. Her stomach dropped. The air felt heavier, colder, and she swore she could feel someone watching her. Her mind raced. What should she do? What could she do? Should she call the police? But she didn't know what to say. It was just a feeling, a sensation of being watched, of being followed through the house. She had no proof, no tangible threat to report. Panicked, she made her way to the kitchen, the only room with a phone landline. She reached for the receiver, but before she could lift it, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy footsteps, moving slowly down the hallway. It was too deliberate, too purposeful to be the house settling. Sarah grabbed the kitchen knife, clutching it in her hand like a lifeline, and backed into the corner of the room. She could hear the footsteps growing louder, closer. A door slammed shut upstairs. Sarah jumped. She couldn't tell if it was real or just her nerves getting the best of her. Then there was a voice, soft and almost pleading. "Help me." Sarah's blood ran cold. It was faint, barely audible, but she heard it clearly. She knew it wasn't her imagination. She hadn't imagined the footsteps or the whispering. Someone was here with her. Without thinking, she ran for the back door. She didn't care if she had to run barefoot in the rain. She just needed to get out of the house. She flung the door open and bolted into the night, her breath ragged in the cold air. Sarah didn't stop running until she reached her neighbor's house. She knocked frantically, and when they opened the door, she stumbled inside, shaking uncontrollably. Her neighbor, Mrs. Winters, was startled but immediately ushered her in. "What's wrong, Sarah?" I don't know. I heard someone in the house. A voice, footsteps. I'm not sure, but I don't want to go back in." Mrs. Winters nodded, her face filled with concern. "You should have stayed with us tonight, but it's all right now. I'll call your parents." Sarah was barely able to speak as Mrs. Winters dialed her parents' number, her hands trembling. Her parents didn't answer, and her heart sank. Mrs. Winters gave her a reassuring smile, but Sarah could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't know what had happened either. Like when Sarah's parents returned the following evening, they were shocked by her story. They went through the house with her, checking every room, but nothing was out of place. No sign of anyone being there. The door to her parents' room was still locked, just as she had left it. But as Sarah sat down to gather her thoughts, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, that something or someone was still in the house. And she wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had never been so grateful for the quiet. My parents were away for the weekend, and I was home alone in the house for the first time in a while. My little brother was at a sleepover, and the peace and solitude felt like a blessing. I relished in the freedom. The house was mine to enjoy, and I planned to make the most of it. The evening was uneventful. I made myself dinner, watched a movie, and then settled into my room to read. The house creaked and groaned around me, as it always did, but I was used to that. I found comfort in those sounds. They were familiar, like the house had its own rhythm. The wind was picking up outside, causing the branches of the trees to scrape against the windows. The kind of noise that, if you let it, could make your mind start to wander. At around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I wasn't tired, but I figured I should get some rest. I turned off the lights, locked the doors, and made sure the windows were shut before climbing into bed. I just started to drift off when I heard it. A soft thud, like something had fallen to the ground. I immediately sat up, straining to listen. The house was dead quiet. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a book I'd left on the floor shifting or a settling noise from the old house. But then it came again, this time a little louder. Another thud, followed by a faint scraping sound. I felt my heart race. The noise was coming from downstairs, from the direction of the living room. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to calm my breathing. It's just the house, I told myself. Just the house settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I waited, listening intently, but nothing else came. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it was safe to go back to sleep. The noises had stopped, and I tried to relax. I closed my eyes, willing myself to forget about it. Then I heard the footsteps. It was unmistakable, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the hardwood floor downstairs. My blood ran cold. There was no way it could be anyone. My parents were hours away, my brother was gone, and I hadn't heard any car doors or voices. I told myself it was just the house again. The wind, maybe, or the pipes. But I couldn't deny the sense of dread creeping up my spine. The footsteps weren't random. They were rhythmic, like someone pacing the floor. I lay frozen, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear them approaching the stairs. The sudden thought hit me like a punch to the gut. What if someone is in the house? I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my hands trembling. I texted my best friend, trying to keep my nerves in check. Hey, just checking in. I heard some weird noises downstairs. Am I being paranoid? I stared at the screen, waiting for a response, but the little bubbles of typing never appeared. I thought about calling the police, but what if it was just a mistake? I couldn't even explain it clearly over the phone. What would I say? I think I heard someone walking around in my house, but there's no one here. The footsteps grew louder. Whoever, or whatever, was downstairs, they were coming up. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or make a sound. My breath was shallow, and I clutched the phone to my chest, praying for it to stop. But then I heard something else. A faint voice, barely audible, as though it was coming from the very walls. Hello? It wasn't a shout or a scream, but a whisper. The voice was soft and distant, yet unmistakable. I could barely think straight. I felt like I was suffocating, the air thick with panic. I slowly stood from the bed, tiptoeing toward the door. I needed to make sure I was hearing things right. I needed to confirm that no one was in the house. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I moved toward the hallway, every sound now amplified in the oppressive silence. The house seemed to have a life of its own. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. I gripped the doorknob tightly, opening it just enough to peer down the stairs. The hallway was dark. I couldn't see much, but I could hear it. The faint sound of shuffling footsteps, slow and deliberate, was coming from the kitchen now. I felt my pulse quicken as I crept down the stairs, keeping to the shadows. Every inch of the house seemed to be watching me, and I was certain that I wasn't alone. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. There, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, was a shadow. It was tall, looming in the dark, with no discernible features, just a mass of blackness against the dim light. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. I stood there, staring at the shape, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and then it moved. The shadow shifted, slowly turning toward me. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see any face, no expression, just a hollow, overwhelming presence. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. I had to get out, to leave, but I couldn't. I turned and ran toward the front door, but as soon as I reached it, the handle wouldn't budge. I tried again, frantic now, pulling on the knob with all my strength. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, echoed behind me. "Let me out!" I whispered desperately, but my voice felt too small. The house seemed to close in on me, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. I could hear the thing getting closer, its movements slow and methodical, like it was savoring my fear. I screamed, and this time my voice was loud. The door burst open and I bolted outside, not stopping until I was across the yard. I didn't even look back at the house. I didn't care if the thing followed me. All I wanted was to get away. I spent the rest of the night at my neighbor's house, too scared to even consider going back. The next morning, I returned home with my parents. The house was exactly as I had left it. No signs of forced entry, nothing disturbed. I never mentioned what happened. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that something was in that house that night. Something that wasn't human, something that was watching me from the shadows. And I don't know if it's gone. I don't know if it's still there, waiting for the next time I'm home alone. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I was home alone for the weekend. My parents had left to visit my aunt in another city, and my older brother was away at college. I had the house to myself, something that felt like a luxury, but I was also aware that my parents never left for extended periods. It was something they didn't like to do often, but it was always nice to have the space to myself. The house was old, built in the early 1900s, and while I loved it, I was never entirely comfortable being in it alone. There was a constant creaking of the floorboards, a draft that swept through certain rooms, and the soft hum of the aging pipes. But these were just things that came with living in a house like ours. I tried to tell myself that nothing was amiss, especially when it came to the noises that echoed through the house late at night. It was just old wood settling, I reasoned. Just the sounds of the house living its life. The first night was uneventful. I ordered pizza, watched a movie, and went to bed around midnight. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, but I slept soundly, lulled by the familiar sounds of the house. The next evening, things started to feel a little strange. I had spent the day on the couch, catching up on some reading, when I heard a soft sound coming from upstairs. It was a quiet thud, almost like something falling on the floor. I paused and waited, but the house remained still. No footsteps, no movement, just the soft thud. I pushed it from my mind, telling myself that it was probably just something shifting on the shelf or a window rattling in the wind. It was common for old houses to make odd noises. The house was just settling. I went upstairs around 8 p.m. to get ready for bed. As I walked past the hallway, I noticed that my parents' bedroom door was slightly ajar. I hadn't opened it, and it was unusual for them to leave it that way. The hallway light flickered as I walked by, and I felt a chill that made me pause for a moment. I shrugged it off, thinking it was the breeze from the open window. I didn't think much more about it until later that night. I was in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. A soft thud, like something being dropped. This time, it was coming from the direction of my parents' bedroom. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The thud repeated. It was like a dull thumping sound, as if something heavy was being dropped onto the floor in the room across the hall. My mind raced, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe one of the old books in my parents' room had fallen off the shelf, but why was it so loud? And why was it happening at this time of night? I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor, and tiptoed toward the hallway. The house was quiet, and the shadows stretched long and dark along the floor. I stood at the door to my parents' room, listening intently, but all I could hear was silence. No thudding, no sounds of movement, just the deep silence of the house. I pushed open the door slowly. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon shining through the partially open curtains. The room looked unchanged. The bed was neatly made, the furniture in place, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. I stood there for a moment, waiting for any sign of movement. The silence was suffocating. I closed the door quietly and went back to my room, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. It was just my imagination. The house was old, after all, and it had its quirks. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered in my chest. Around midnight, I woke up again to the sound of something. This time, it wasn't a thud, but a distinct scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder. It was coming from the hallway, just outside my door. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, as the scraping continued. It was faint at first, but now it was unmistakable. Something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I waited in the dark, frozen in fear. The scraping was slow, deliberate, as if whatever it was had no rush to stop. It felt close now, too close, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, trying to silence it so it wouldn't give me away, but as I looked at the screen, I felt my blood run cold. The hallway light had just flickered on. I hadn't turned it on. I hadn't heard anyone move. I stared at the light, my mind racing. I should have called my parents. I should have left the house, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I heard the scraping again, closer now, right outside my door. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the edge of the blanket, clutching it tightly around me. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on my door. I screamed, unable to stop myself. It was a deafening sound, like someone had slammed their fist into the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I scrambled out of bed, not knowing what to do. I grabbed my phone and ran out of my room, my mind frantically searching for an explanation. The hallway was dark, the light now off again, but the door to my parents' room was open. I hadn't opened it, and standing in the doorway was a figure, a shape, pale and indistinct but undeniably there. I froze, unable to move or scream. The figure stood motionless, its presence looming over the dark hallway. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it. The air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I didn't waste another second. I bolted down the stairs and out of the house, running barefoot across the front yard, not looking back until I reached my neighbor's house. I pounded on their door and they let me in, startled by my frantic state. I stayed with them for the rest of the night, unable to return to the house. The next morning, I went back with them to gather my things. The house was silent again, as though nothing had happened. There were no signs of anything unusual, no indication that something had been in the hallway with me. But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had seen, or what I thought I had seen. The scraping sounds, the figure in the doorway, the chill in the air, they all felt so real. And even now, every time I'm home alone, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me from the shadows, waiting for the next time I'm alone. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was the kind of night that felt too quiet. The kind that makes you aware of every small sound in the house. I had been looking forward to this weekend. My parents were visiting my aunt, and my older brother was at a friend's house. For the first time in a long while, I had the house to myself. I'd planned to catch up on some shows, maybe finish a book, and just enjoy the peace and quiet. That evening, I made dinner and settled on the couch, a blanket wrapped around me. The house was old, drafty, with creaking floors and walls that seemed to have a life of their own, but it had always been home. Nothing ever felt unusual. Sure, there were the usual creaks and pops that came with an old house settling, but those sounds were familiar. I'd lived there my whole life. The night passed uneventfully. By midnight, I was ready to head to bed. I turned off the TV, locked the doors, and checked the windows, just as I always did. I wasn't paranoid about safety or anything, but I didn't like the idea of leaving the house open. After double-checking everything, I climbed into bed. The room was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting faint shadows on the walls. It was still too quiet, and I found myself lying there, wide awake, listening to the night. There was nothing wrong, nothing that should have made me feel uneasy, but I couldn't help it. I just had this strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I tried to brush it off as anxiety or just the product of too much time alone, but the feeling lingered. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. Then I heard it. A sound that made my heart skip a beat, a soft, slow tap, tap, tap from somewhere downstairs. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the house settling, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I sat up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. I waited, straining my ears to listen. The sound didn't stop. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch brushing against the window. It was something more purposeful. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand and checked the time. It was 1:15 a.m. I stared at the screen for a few seconds, trying to decide if I should call someone. Maybe my brother or even my parents, though I didn't want to sound ridiculous. The tapping continued, and I felt my pulse quicken. I tried to rationalize it. It was probably a mouse or a creaky old pipe. My mind was playing tricks on me. But even as I told myself that, the tapping grew louder as if it were getting closer. I didn't want to be a coward, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. I crept out of bed, trying to be as quiet as possible. My feet were cold on the hardwood floor as I padded out into the hallway. The house was dark, save for the dim glow of the moonlight creeping through the windows. I made my way toward the staircase, the sound of my footsteps far too loud in the silence. The tap, tap, tap came again, now clearly from downstairs. I reached the top of the stairs and paused, feeling the tension in the air. I peered down the hallway toward the living room. The sound was coming from there, unmistakable. I couldn't see anything out of place, but I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. I wanted to go back to my room, lock the door, and pretend none of this was happening. But curiosity and fear pushed me forward. I slowly descended the stairs, my eyes scanning every corner of the dark house. As I reached the bottom, the tapping stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise had been. I stood there in the dark living room, unsure of what to do. The house was still, not a single creak or groan. Everything seemed perfectly normal, too normal, in fact. I told myself I was being foolish. Maybe it had been the house settling after all. Just as I was about to turn and go back up the stairs, I heard something else. A faint voice. Barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Hello? My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. It wasn't even a voice that belonged to anyone in my family. It was thin, distant, but somehow clear, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up and I couldn't force any sound out. My body refused to move, locked in place by a mixture of fear and disbelief. I didn't know what to do. The house was old, sure, but this didn't feel like just a noise. It felt wrong. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening for any other sounds, but there was only silence. My breath was shallow and every inch of me screamed to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away. I finally found the courage to move. Slowly, cautiously, I made my way toward the kitchen. The dim light from the stove cast long shadows across the room, but it was empty. Nothing was out of place. No one was there. I checked the back door, the windows. Everything was locked, just like I'd left it. No sign of forced entry. I walked back to the living room, but the hairs on the back of my neck my pulse was racing, my mind a blur of confusion and fear. Was I imagining things? Was I losing my mind from the silence and isolation of being home alone? But then, just as I was about to retreat upstairs, I heard it again. A loud bang. It came from upstairs, from my room. I rushed up the stairs, my feet clumsy and fast, nearly tripping over the steps. When I reached the hallway, I froze again. The door to my room was wide open. I never left it open. I knew I had locked it when I went downstairs. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was undisturbed. Nothing had been moved. No one was there. But the air was thick with an oppressive presence. I could feel it. The weight of something or someone, invisible yet very real. I could almost hear the quiet breathing, feel the chill on the back of my neck. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I should scream, run, or call someone. My phone was still in my pocket, but I couldn't make myself move. And then, as if responding to my thoughts, I felt a cold hand brush against the back of my neck. A chill spread down my spine, and the air around me seemed to freeze. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of the room and down the stairs, my heart racing in my chest. The front door. I had to get out. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, not bothering to lock it behind me. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to be outside, away from the house. I ran to the neighbor's house, barely able to breathe, my legs trembling beneath me. I pounded on the door and they let me in without question. I spent the rest of the night there, waiting for my family to come back. When they did, I didn't tell them about what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I couldn't stay in that house alone again. The next day, I went back with my parents. Everything was in its place, just like before. The house was quiet. The tapping, the whispers, the cold presence. Nothing remained except the lingering feeling of unease. I never spent another night alone in that house. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I was home alone for the first time in months. My parents had gone away for the weekend, and my brother was at a friend's house. I had the whole place to myself, And although it felt strange at first, I quickly settled into the quiet. The house was old but cozy. It creaked with age, the floors groaning whenever you moved through them, the walls whispering with the wind. But it was home. Nothing to be afraid of, I told myself. I spent the evening watching TV, enjoying the peace. My parents had left me a list of things to take care of, but it wasn't much. Take out the trash, check the mail, and make sure the front door was locked at night. It was the kind of evening that felt like a breath of fresh air. No one to answer to, no noise. The house felt like it belonged to me for the moment. Around 11 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I wasn't tired, but I figured I'd start getting ready to sleep. I locked all the windows, double-checked the front and back doors, and switched off all the lights. The moonlight shone through the curtains in my bedroom, casting faint shadows across the walls. I settled into bed and reached for my phone to check any messages. As I scrolled through social media, I began to hear it. At first, it was barely noticeable, a slight creaking sound like the floorboards groaning under someone's weight. I paused, holding my breath, straining to listen. The noise came again. This time it was louder. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. It was an old house, after all. The wind outside might have caused the floorboards to creak. I told myself that over and over, trying to push the growing anxiety from my chest. But then came the sound I couldn't ignore. A soft tapping, almost like knuckles gently tapping against a door. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My stomach churned. I sat up in bed, holding my phone like a lifeline. I listened, my heartbeat thumping in my ears. The tapping continued, echoing through the house in a slow, rhythmic pattern. It was coming from the hallway outside my room. I told myself to stay calm. It was probably a branch scraping against the window, or maybe something shifting in the walls. But the tapping didn't stop. It didn't sound like wind, or an animal, or even a settling noise. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I grabbed my phone and sent a quick text to my friend, trying to distract myself. "Hey, just checking in. You up?" The tapping continued. I could feel my pulse in my throat now, and I tried to ignore the gnawing fear clawing at my chest. I stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible, and tiptoed to my door. The house was completely silent now, the tapping stopping as if it had never happened. I hesitated for a moment. Should I go check it out? My heart raced. I knew I had to. I couldn't stay in my room, not with that unsettling feeling hanging in the air. I slowly opened my bedroom door and peeked into the dark hallway. It was empty. The moonlight barely illuminated the passage, but I could see the faint outlines of the furniture, the old photos on the walls. The house was silent again. I felt stupid for being so afraid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started walking down the hallway, the old floorboards creaking underfoot. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, stretching ahead into the darkness. I reached the stairs that led down to the living room, the area where the noise had come from. I stood at the top of the stairs, listening intently, my breath shallow. For a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard it again, a sound that chilled me to the bone. The soft tap, tap, tap. This time, it came from downstairs, from the living room, the exact place where I had just been sitting earlier watching TV. My stomach twisted. I had to go down there. I needed to know what was causing the noise, what was making that tapping sound. Slowly, I descended the stairs, each step groaning under my weight, echoing through the empty house. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused. I didn't know what I expected to see, but I had to check. The living room was empty. The TV was off, the lights dim. Everything was as I had left it earlier. But there was something off about the room, like it didn't quite feel right. The air felt heavier, colder. I looked around, and that's when I noticed it. The front door was slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it open. In fact, I knew for a fact that I had locked it earlier. I had checked the door multiple times that evening. I walked toward it slowly, my hands trembling as I reached for the doorknob. The cold metal sent a shock of electricity through my body as I twisted it shut. I locked the door again and took a step back, my eyes scanning the room for anything out of place. But there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. It was nothing. Just an old house, some strange noises. I must have imagined it. I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard it again, a soft voice, almost a whisper, a voice that didn't belong. "Hello?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. It wasn't even a voice I had ever heard before. It was soft, almost breathless, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I froze. There was no one here. I was sure of it. I had checked the whole house, locked everything. My parents wouldn't be home until tomorrow. I was alone. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I couldn't move. My feet felt like lead as I slowly turned toward the kitchen. The voice had sounded so real, so close, as if someone was standing just behind me. I forced myself to walk, each step slower than the last, my body tense and ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. I reached the kitchen doorway and looked inside. The lights were off. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. The room was empty. No one was there. I turned on the lights, feeling a little better now that I could see. There was nothing. No one. But then, something caught my eye. A small item was out of place, sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. It was a picture frame. I knew for sure that I had not left it there. I had seen it earlier on the shelf by the window. It was a photo of my parents and me from a vacation years ago. I reached for it, my fingers shaking, and turned it over. The back of the frame had a note on it, written in messy handwriting. "I'm here, I've been watching you." I felt my blood run cold. My mind raced, my thoughts spinning. There was no way anyone could have been in the house. The doors were locked and the windows were shut tight. Yet somehow this note had appeared. Suddenly, I felt the temperature in the room drop. A cold draft swept through the kitchen, even though all the windows were closed. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. And there, standing at the edge of the hallway, was a shadow, a dark, shifting figure. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of something tall, something human-shaped, but wrong. It didn't belong. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I ran, full speed, back to the stairs and up into my room, slamming the door behind me. My hands fumbled to lock the door, but I didn't care. I just needed to be away from whatever was downstairs. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning came, I was exhausted, drained, but too terrified to tell anyone what had happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. The next day, when my parents came home, I didn't mention anything. Everything seemed normal again. The house was still, the doors still locked, and the photo frame was back in its place on the shelf. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was that had visited me that night was still there, watching from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had never wanted to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. My parents had raised me to be rational, to think logically, and not let my imagination get the best of me. But one night, when I was home alone, something happened that I couldn't explain. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a Friday evening, and my parents had gone away for the weekend. My older sister was off at a friend's house, leaving me in the house alone. I was excited for the quiet time to myself. I had always enjoyed being alone. It gave me a chance to watch movies, play video games, or just enjoy the stillness of the house. The house itself was old, built in the 1920s, but it was comfortable. It creaked and groaned sometimes, especially in the winter, but I never thought much of it. It was just the house settling. The evening started off uneventfully. I made dinner, watched a few episodes of my favorite show, and eventually curled up in the living room with a book. The house felt peaceful, the soft glow of the lamp by my side casting a warm light over the room. But as the hours passed, the quiet began to feel heavy. It was as if the house itself was watching me. Around 10 p.m., I decided to head to bed. I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs to my room. As I passed through the hallway, I heard a faint noise. It sounded like someone was walking on the floor upstairs. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I was sure I was alone. There was no one else in the house. My first instinct was to tell myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps a rodent scurrying around in the walls. I had heard those sounds before, but this was different. It sounded deliberate, as if someone was moving slowly, step by step, across the floor. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way upstairs, my curiosity getting the better of me. The house was completely still, and there was no one in the hallway. The sound had stopped. I checked each room, even the attic, but no one was there. I stood in the middle of the hallway for a moment, listening. All was silent. I let out a breath and chalked it up to my imagination playing tricks on me. I had been reading for a while, and sometimes when you're tired, your mind can start to create things that aren't there. I returned to my room and got into bed, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. But as I lay there, trying to fall asleep, I heard the noise again. This time, it was clearer. Footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the upstairs hallway. The floorboards creaked with each step. I shot upright in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. This was no mouse or house settling. Someone was walking around up there. I grabbed my phone, ready to call my parents or even the police if I had to, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me again. Maybe it was just the wind, or perhaps it was the house's old pipes making strange sounds. But no, this was different. This felt real. I stood up, slowly making my way to the door. I opened it just a crack and peered down the hallway. Nothing. The house was dark, eerily so. The sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked cautiously to the top of the stairs and peered down. The living room below was empty, the faint glow of the streetlights outside casting long shadows on the floor. Everything seemed fine. But then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were coming from the floor directly above me. My blood ran cold. The attic. I froze. No one had been up there, but I knew that's where the noise was coming from. The attic in our house was only accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway, and I had never felt comfortable going up there. The wooden stairs creaked under your weight, and the air always felt heavy, like something was watching you. I stood there for a moment, the sound of footsteps growing louder. It was as though someone was pacing back and forth in the attic. My first thought was to call my sister and tell her to come home, but I knew she wouldn't be able to get here for hours. And what could she do anyway? This wasn't something you could just explain away. I hesitated for a long time, but something inside me told me I had to investigate. I couldn't just stay there, listening to the footsteps, getting closer and closer. I made my way back downstairs and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. With the flashlight in hand, I slowly made my way to the pull-down ladder. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to pull it down, the creaking sound echoing through the still house. I shone the flashlight up into the dark, musty attic. The beam of light barely reached the far corners of the room. There was nothing up there, but the air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I climbed the ladder slowly, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I paused for a moment, my heart racing. I could hear the sound of breathing, faint but steady, like someone was waiting for me. I turned on the flashlight and shone it across the attic. My stomach twisted as I scanned the room. There was nothing unusual: old furniture, boxes of forgotten memories, and cobwebs. But then, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the far corner, just barely visible in the dim light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but then I realized it was a person. A tall figure, wearing an old-fashioned suit and hat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing away from me, as if it were waiting. I froze, unable to move or speak. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I could feel my legs shaking as I backed away from the ladder, trying to put as much distance between myself and the figure as possible. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had to force myself to keep my breathing steady. The figure didn't turn, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was aware of my presence, but it had no intention of acknowledging me. I backed down the ladder as quietly as I could, never taking my eyes off the figure. When my feet hit the bottom of the stairs, I bolted to the living room and grabbed my phone, calling my parents. The phone rang for a few moments before my mother picked up. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy from sleep. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. I was too scared to speak clearly, and my thoughts were scattered. All I could say was that I needed them to come home. They didn't get home until early the next morning. When I told them about what happened, they dismissed it. They told me I was tired, that it was just my imagination. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. And now, every time I'm alone in the house, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting for the right moment to make themselves known again. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
It was one of those rare occasions where I found myself home alone. My parents had gone out for the weekend, and my older sister was visiting her friend in another town. At first, the idea of being alone in the house didn't seem like anything unusual. I was used to being on my own, even though I'd always been a little uneasy in our house. It wasn't anything major, just the old creaks of the floorboards, the constant flicker of the hallway light, and the way the windows rattled when the wind picked up. Still, it felt peaceful, or so I thought. The first night passed quietly. I ate dinner, watched TV, and went to bed around midnight. The house was dark and still, the only noise being the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. A soft thudding noise, like something or someone was walking around. I lay in bed, frozen. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. I could hear it clearly. It was faint at first, but it was there. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the upstairs hallway. My heart started racing, and I immediately checked the time on my phone. 2:37 a.m. I didn't have any pets that could have made the noise, and I was certain no one else was home. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe it was a branch hitting the side of the house. I'd heard strange noises before, especially in the dead of night. But then the sound came again, louder this time, as if it was coming closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the footsteps continued. The fear started to build in my chest, and I forced myself to get out of bed. I tiptoed to the door and cracked it open slightly, peering out into the dark hallway. The house was silent once again. No footsteps, no movement. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. It wasn't a person, but it was something moving, an outline, just barely visible in the darkness at the end of the hallway. I froze. The figure wasn't clear, but it seemed to be standing still, watching me. My heart raced as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. I had to get closer. Slowly, carefully, I stepped into the hallway, my breath shallow. As I moved toward the figure, I realized it was gone. No more movement, no outline in the shadows. The hallway was completely still. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the light had played tricks on my eyes. I went back to my room, heart still pounding, and shut the door behind me. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. It wasn't until the next morning that things took a darker turn. When I went downstairs for breakfast, I noticed something odd. The front door, which I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but enough to let a small draft in. I immediately rushed to the door, checking the lock, but everything seemed intact. I convinced myself that I had simply forgotten to lock it, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The house was old, and it had always had its quirks. Still, it was odd. I knew I had locked it. Later that evening, after dinner, I decided to clean up a little. As I moved around the house, I noticed something else strange. One of the chairs in the dining room was facing the wrong way. I hadn't touched it, and neither had anyone else. I knew for a fact that it had been turned the other way when I had left the room earlier. It was subtle, but unsettling. I tried to dismiss it, but the house had an eerie quality to it that night. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, and I could swear I saw something flicker at the edge of my vision every now and then. At one point, I even heard the faint sound of a voice, whispering, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I went to check, but there was no one there. Nothing out of place. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining things? Was it just the loneliness of being home alone getting to me? I couldn't be sure, but it felt real, too real to ignore. By the time midnight rolled around, I was exhausted but too uneasy to sleep. I stayed on the couch, watching TV with the volume low, trying to distract myself. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear the trees scraping against the side of the house. It was a typical stormy night, but something about it felt different. The house felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to hum, the floor creaked with every step, and the air felt colder than usual. That's when I heard it again. A soft sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor upstairs. The noise was slow, deliberate. The sound grew louder, as if whatever it was coming down the stairs. I froze, my body tense with fear. There was no way anyone could be in the house. I was alone, and yet the noise was unmistakable. I grabbed my phone, dialing my sister's number. She didn't pick up. I called my parents, but the call went straight to voicemail. The noise was getting closer, moving down the stairs now. I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps, slow, heavy steps, like someone walking toward me. My body was shaking, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The steps stopped, just outside the living room door. I held my breath, waiting, but there was no sound after that. Silence. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my throat was tight with fear. I slowly stood up and crept toward the door. I peered through the crack, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, dark and silent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, ran out the front door, and didn't look back. I spent the night in the neighbor's house, too terrified to return until morning. When I finally did go back, everything seemed normal. The door was locked, the house was quiet, and nothing appeared out of place. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. The house felt different after that night. It wasn't the same place I had known before, and though I stayed there for many more months, I never quite felt safe again. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of light made my heart race. Something had been there that night, something that wasn't quite human. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I had always enjoyed the rare occasions when I was home alone. It wasn't something that happened often, but when it did, I made the most of it. I would binge watch shows, enjoy my favorite snacks, and relish in the stillness of the house. My parents and younger brother had gone away for the weekend to visit family, leaving me behind to take care of the house and the dog. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just me and my thoughts. Little did I know it would be anything but. The first night was uneventful. I made dinner, cleaned up, and spent the evening watching TV. As the night wore on, I grew tired. I locked all the doors, made sure the windows were secure, and settled into bed with the soft hum of the house around me. The usual creaks of the floorboards, the rustling of leaves outside in the wind, they were familiar, comforting sounds. I'd heard them hundreds of times and they never bothered me. But that night, around 2 a.m., something was different. I had just drifted into a light sleep when I was suddenly jolted awake by a soft thud, followed by a low scrape. My eyes shot open. My heart began to race as I lay there, listening. The house was silent, aside from the occasional creaking of the wooden beams. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scrape came again, louder this time, followed by a faint tapping. It sounded like someone was walking around downstairs, dragging their feet along the floor. My mind raced. I told myself it was probably just the house settling. Maybe the dog had gotten up and was pacing around, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I lay perfectly still, listening for any more sounds. After a few minutes of silence, I decided to get up. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a creak of the house. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and quietly opened my bedroom door. The hallway was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through the windows, casting long shadows on the walls. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way downstairs, each step of the creaky wooden stairs making my heart pound faster. I reached the bottom of the stairs and walked through the living room, which was dark except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside. The silence was suffocating. I slowly approached the hallway that led to the kitchen, my eyes scanning the shadows. As I got closer, I could hear the faint sound of breathing, shallow, almost imperceptible. I froze. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't the dog. It wasn't my parents. It was something else. Someone else. I slowly reached for the kitchen light and flicked the switch. The room was empty. No one was there. I turned around to head back toward the living room, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The front door, which I had locked earlier, was wide open. Panic surged through me. I rushed to the door, checking to make sure it was still locked. I tugged on the handle, and it clicked shut, but the eerie feeling remained. I was convinced that someone had been in the house. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I call the police? Should I check the whole house? I felt a rising sense of dread, but I didn't know if I was just being paranoid or if something truly was wrong. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. I turned off the kitchen light, walked back through the living room, and made my way back up the stairs. As I reached the top, I paused, listening carefully. I felt as though someone was watching me, as though I wasn't alone. I stepped into my bedroom and locked the door behind me. The feeling of unease gnawed at me, but I tried to push it aside. I pulled the blankets up around me, convinced that I was just letting my imagination run wild. I closed my eyes, attempting to force myself back to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Every little sound made me jump. Every shadow in the corner of my room seemed like it might be someone, lurking in the darkness. It was well past 3 a.m. when I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. But even in my dreams, I felt the presence of something. It was as if the house itself was watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep so it could reveal whatever it had been hiding. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check the doors and windows again. Everything was locked as I had left it. The house was eerily quiet, and yet something still felt off. I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me all day. I found myself constantly checking behind me, feeling as though I wasn't truly alone. The next evening, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I left the house, taking the dog with me for a bit of fresh air. The sun had set by the time we returned, casting long shadows across the yard. When we got back to the house, I noticed something strange. The front door was ajar again. I didn't know what to think. I was certain I had locked it before I left. I checked the back door as well, but it was secure. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I stepped inside, making sure to lock the door behind me. The house was still, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of the trees outside. I decided to take a shower to calm myself down. As the hot water poured over me, I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe I'd just forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I had left it open on accident earlier. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something or someone was in the house. When I finished showering, I wrapped myself in a towel and stepped out of the bathroom. My heart nearly stopped when I saw the reflection in the bathroom mirror. There, in the foggy glass, was the faint outline of a figure standing behind me. I whipped around, but the room was empty. I felt my knees go weak, and I barely managed to steady myself against the wall. I knew I had to leave the house, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I quickly dressed, my hands trembling as I put on my clothes. I grabbed my phone and called my parents. No answer. I called my brother. No answer. I was utterly alone. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I had to fight the urge to scream. I grabbed the dog and ran outside, calling my parents as I stepped into the yard. They answered, sounding confused. I tried to explain what was happening, but I couldn't make sense of it myself. How could I explain the tapping, the breathing, the open door? After a long conversation, my parents assured me they'd be home the next day, and they told me to stay calm and lock all the doors. I reluctantly went back inside, locked everything up, and spent the rest of the night with the lights on, my mind racing with fear. When they returned the next day, nothing seemed out of place. The doors were locked, the house was still, and everything appeared normal. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. I couldn't shake the unease that lingered long after they returned. I didn't want to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? They'd just think I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in the house with me that weekend was still there, watching from the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 13.
It was one of those rare occasions where I found myself home alone. My parents had gone out for the weekend, and my older sister was visiting her friend in another town. At first, the idea of being alone in the house didn't seem like anything unusual. I was used to being on my own, even though I'd always been a little uneasy in our house. It wasn't anything major, just the old creaks of the floorboards, the constant flicker of the hallway light, and the way the windows rattled when the wind picked up. Still, it felt peaceful. Or so I thought. The first night passed quietly. I ate dinner, watched TV, and went to bed around midnight. The house was dark and still, the only noise being the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that sent a shiver down my spine, a soft thudding noise, like something or someone was walking around. I lay in bed, frozen. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the house. I could hear it clearly. It was faint at first, but it was there, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the upstairs hallway. My heart started racing, and I immediately checked the time on my phone, 2:37 a.m. I didn't have any pets that could have made the noise, and I was certain no one else was home. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe it was a branch hitting the side of the house. I'd heard strange noises before, especially in the dead of night, but then the sound came again, louder this time, as if it was coming closer. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the footsteps continued. The fear started to build in my chest, and I forced myself to get out of bed. I tiptoed to the door and cracked it open slightly, peering out into the dark hallway. The house was silent once again. No footsteps, no movement. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something shift. It wasn't a person, but it was something moving, an outline, just barely visible in the darkness at the end of the hallway. I froze. The figure wasn't clear, but it seemed to be standing still, watching me. My heart raced as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. I had to get closer. Slowly, carefully, I stepped into the hallway, my breath shallow. As I moved toward the figure, I realized it was gone. No more movement, no outline in the shadows. The hallway was completely still. I stood there for a long time, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the light had played tricks on my eyes. I went back to my room, heart still pounding, and shut the door behind me. I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, trying to shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. It wasn't until the next morning that things took a darker turn. When I went downstairs for breakfast, I noticed something odd. The front door, which I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. It wasn't wide open, but enough to let a small draft in. I immediately rushed to the door, checking the lock, but everything seemed intact. I convinced myself that I had simply forgotten to lock it, but deep down, I wasn't sure. The house was old, and it had always had its quirks. Still, it was odd. I knew I had locked it. Later that evening, after dinner, I decided to clean up a little. As I moved around the house, I noticed something else strange. One of the chairs in the dining room was facing the wrong way. I hadn't touched it, and neither had anyone else. I knew for a fact that it had been turned the other way when I had left the room earlier. It was subtle, but unsettling. I tried to dismiss it, but the house had an eerie quality to it that night. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, and I could swear I saw something flicker at the edge of my vision every now and then. At one point, I even heard the faint sound of a voice, whispering, coming from the direction of the kitchen. I went to check, but there was no one there, nothing out of place. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining things? Was it just the loneliness of being home alone getting to me? I couldn't be sure, but it felt real. Too real to ignore. By the time midnight rolled around, I was exhausted but too uneasy to sleep. I stayed on the couch, watching TV with the volume low, trying to distract myself. The wind outside had picked up, and I could hear the trees scraping against the side of the house. It was a typical stormy night, but something about it felt different. The house felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to hum, the floor creaked with every step, and the air felt colder than usual. That's when I heard it again, a soft sound like someone dragging something heavy across the floor upstairs. The noise was slow, deliberate. The sound grew louder, as if whatever it was coming down the stairs. I froze, my body tense with fear. There was no way anyone could be in the house. I was alone, and yet the noise was unmistakable. I grabbed my phone, dialing my sister's number. She didn't pick up. I called my parents, but the call went straight to voicemail. The noise was getting closer, moving down the stairs now. I could hear the distinct sound of footsteps, Slow, heavy steps like someone walking toward me. My body was shaking, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The steps stopped just outside the living room door. I held my breath, waiting, but there was no sound after that. Silence. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my throat was tight with fear. I slowly stood up and crept toward the door. I peered through the crack, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, dark and silent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys, ran out the front door, and didn't look back. I spent the night in the neighbor's house, too terrified to return until morning. When I finally did go back, everything seemed normal. The door was locked, the house was quiet, and nothing appeared out of place. But I knew what I had heard. I knew what I had felt. The house felt different after that night. It wasn't the same place I had known before, and though I stayed there for many more months, I never quite felt safe again. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every flicker of light made my heart race. Something had been there that night, something that wasn't quite human. Story the end.